By the autumn of 1887, everybody in Dry Creek knew exactly why Caleb Mercer was getting married. It wasn't for companionship. It wasn't for love. And it surely wasn't because he had suddenly grown tired of eating beans alone beside his stove every winter. It was for cattle, 238 head of longhorns, to be exact. The cattle belonged to Walter Bennett, an aging rancher whose lungs had been giving out for years. Bennett owned one of the better grazing stretches along Cottonwood Creek, but he had only one heir, his daughter, Eleanor. Most folks expected the Bennett ranch to be sold after Walter died. Few imagined Eleanor would remain in the territory afterward. She had spent years caring for her father and keeping books for neighboring ranches, but the West wasn't known for handing ranches to women. Caleb saw opportunity where others saw sentiment. At T34, he owned a modest spread with good fencing and terrible luck. 2 drought years and 1 brutal winter had cut his herd nearly in half. He needed cattle if he intended to survive another season. So when Walter Bennett quietly suggested marriage, Caleb listened. The arrangement was simple enough. Caleb would marry Eleanor. The ranches would eventually combine. The Bennett cattle would strengthen the Mercer brand. Everyone would benefit. At least, that was how Caleb explained it to anyone who asked. The wedding itself lasted less than 20 minutes. No musicians. No celebration. Just a preacher, 6 witnesses, and dust blowing through Dry Creek's single church window. Eleanor wore a plain blue dress. Caleb wore his Sunday coat. Neither smiled much. Afterward, while guests shared coffee outside, Caleb overheard 2 old ranch hands talking. "Poor girl," one muttered. "Why poor?" "Because that man looks at her the same way he looks at livestock." Caleb pretended not to hear. 3 weeks later, he moved into the Bennett property. His eyes went first to the cattle pens. Strong animals, healthy coats, good breeding stock. Exactly what he'd hoped for. Eleanor noticed. "You haven't once asked about the orchard," she said one evening. Caleb shrugged. "I'm a cattleman." "You haven't asked about the irrigation channels either." "I don't farm." She nodded quietly. "You should." Winter arrived early. Snow rolled down from the mountains before Thanksgiving and settled hard across the valley. By December, feed prices had doubled. By January, neighboring ranchers had started selling stock cheap to avoid losing entire herds. Caleb wasn't worried. Not yet. He had numbers on his side now. 2 ranches, hundreds of cattle, more land than he'd ever owned. He spent long evenings making plans for expansion, more fencing, more grazing leases, maybe even hiring hands year-round. Meanwhile, Eleanor disappeared. Every morning before sunrise, she inspected hay stores, checked water flow beneath frozen channels, recorded feed consumption in ledgers, visited neighboring ranches. Caleb barely noticed, until one night she placed 3 books on the table. "Read these." He frowned. "What are they?" "Our expenses." "I've got my own books." "No," she replied calmly. "You have guesses." He opened the first ledger. Feed reserves, veterinary costs, winter mortality estimates, projected losses if snowfall continued through February. The numbers made his stomach tighten. "If this winter holds," she said, "we lose 60 head before March." "Impossible." "It's mathematics." He stared at her. She stared back. For the first time since their wedding, Caleb realized something uncomfortable. Eleanor understood the ranch better than he did. Far better, but pride is harder to kill than a coyote. He closed the ledger. "We'll manage." Eleanor simply nodded. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, the future of both ranches sat quietly between them on the kitchen table. Part 2. The winter that changed everything. February arrived with storms older ranchers would speak about for decades. Fences disappeared beneath drifts. Creeks froze solid. 3 neighboring outfits lost nearly half their herds. Caleb rode out daily, with hired men, digging through snow for trapped cattle. Every evening, he returned, exhausted and angry. The losses kept growing. Then Eleanor made a decision he hated. "We're selling 70 head. Caleb nearly stood from his chair. "Sell? In this market?" "Now," she replied. "Or bury twice that number in March." Prices were terrible. Buyers knew desperate men had few choices. Selling felt like surrender. Caleb refused. For 3 days they argued. On the fourth morning Eleanor hitched a wagon and rode to Dry Creek herself. By sunset, she returned with contracts signed. The cattle were sold. Caleb was furious. Until March arrived. The storms continued. The ranches that held onto their full herds ran out of feed. Animals weakened. Some froze standing upright. Others wandered through broken fences searching for grass that wasn't there. Caleb watched neighbors lose everything. Meanwhile, the Bennett Mercer ranch still had hay remaining. Not much, but enough. Because 70 cattle had left before the worst arrived. One evening, Caleb sat silently beside the stove. Finally, he asked, "How did you know?" "My father survived the winter of '73. She poured coffee. He taught me that pride eats more cattle than snow ever will." For the first time since marrying her, Caleb laughed. A small laugh, but genuine. Spring thaw finally came in April. The losses across Dry Creek were devastating. Landowners, unable to recover, began selling acreage cheaply. Some packed wagons and headed east. Others simply disappeared. Then Eleanor did something Caleb never expected. She began buying land. Small parcels at first. A grazing strip here, an abandoned orchard there. A creek crossing. A hay meadow. Caleb stared at the paperwork. "How can we afford this?" "We can. Because we sold early." He looked closer. Every document carried the same name. Eleanor Bennett Mercer. Not Caleb Mercer. Her. "The properties are yours?" he asked. "My father's will was specific." She slid the papers across the table. "The Bennett ranch passed entirely to me." Caleb read the document twice. He had assumed marriage meant ownership would naturally become his. It hadn't. Not legally. Not practically. Not in any way that mattered. By May, Eleanor controlled more grazing land than 3 neighboring ranches combined. And she wasn't finished. Part 3. By spring, she owned everything. Grass returned slowly. Green spread across the valley like paint across canvas. Surviving cattle fattened quickly. Prices climbed. For ranchers who had endured winter, fortunes waited on the other side. Eleanor saw opportunities everywhere. She leased pasture to struggling neighbors, purchased equipment from bankrupt outfits, bought water rights along Cottonwood Creek. When the Harper brothers lost their ranch, she offered employment instead of eviction. When old Samuel Reed faced foreclosure, she purchased his debt and gave him 5 years to repay it. People noticed. By June, folks had stopped calling it the Mercer Ranch. It was simply the Bennett place again. Only larger. Much larger. One afternoon, Caleb rode to the ridge overlooking the valley. From there, he could see nearly everything Eleanor now controlled. The southern meadow, the eastern creek, the orchard, the hayfields, the grazing flats. More land than he dreamed of owning in his entire life. Eleanor rode up beside him. "Beautiful view." He nodded. "I used to think all this was going to become mine." She smiled slightly. "You sound disappointed." He looked out over the valley. "Truth is, if it had become mine, I'd have lost half of it by now." She laughed. A real laugh this time. "So, what changes now?" Caleb considered the question carefully. Then he answered honestly, "I stopped pretending I'm the smartest person on this ranch." The wind rolled across the grasslands. Below them, cattle moved like dark rivers across the fields. For a long moment neither spoke. Finally Eleanor said, "My father knew exactly what he was doing." "Setting up the marriage?" "No." She looked toward the valley below. "Making sure the ranch survived." Caleb understood then. Walter Bennett had seen the future more clearly than either of them. He had known his daughter possessed the mind for business and the grit for ranching. He had known Caleb possessed experience, but also pride. Together, they balanced one another. Separately, they might have failed. That autumn, the Bennett brand sold cattle at the highest prices in 10 years. The following spring, they expanded again. By the time rail service reached Dry Creek, Eleanor Mercer owned more land than any rancher in the county. People told stories about how she had built an empire after the terrible winter. Most got the details wrong. Some said she had inherited wealth. Others claimed luck. A few blamed timing. Only Caleb knew the truth. The empire had been built with ledgers, difficult decisions, and the courage to act before everyone else. Years later, when newcomers asked how he had managed to marry the richest ranch owner in the territory, Caleb always gave the same answer. "I thought I was marrying for cattle." He'd glance toward the house where Eleanor was usually working over account books. "Turns out I married the best rancher in the West, and by spring, she owned everything that mattered."